So when I don't even feel like thinking about it, talking about it, yeah, this is where I go.
Now, this is a story I've already referred to during the show. It's a front page story today. It's a big story because every time you hear the Prime Minister or any other minister say we're going to commission an inquiry into that, we're launching an inquiry, there's going to be an inquiry, and you hear it all the time. In fact, almost a day, never a day goes by without an inquiry being announced about something or other, into something or other. But when there is an inquiry, what's supposed to happen next? Well, the results of the inquiry are unveiled. Usually the inquiry makes recommendations. And I suppose we assume that those recommendations will be adhered to and will be acted upon, and therefore whatever was inquired into will be changed and the same problem won't occur again. I think that's what we assume. What's the point of commissioning an inquiry if the inquiry makes reports and no action at all is taken? So, there was an inquiry into the Windrush scandal. If you don't know what the Windrush scandal was, you've forgotten about it, you didn't really realise what it was, we'll explain that in just a minute. But there was an inquiry into the Windrush scandal. A whole list of recommendations were made after this painstaking and punctilious inquiry. And what's just happened today? Well, what's just happened is this. It's being described as a slap in the face. Anger at a U-turn over Windrush. Home Secretary Suella Braverman is to scrap 3 recommendations from the Windrush inquiry. The government originally adopted all 30 of the proposals in the report, but has now backtracked on 3 of them. This is what they were. Establishing a commissioner responsible for speaking up for migrants and those affected by the system directly or indirectly. Giving the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration new powers, and holding a series of reconciliation events with people impacted to listen and reflect on those stories. So those are 3 of the recommendations that Suella Braverman has drawn right through with a red pen, just crossed out, just forget those 3. There are many others that haven't been acted on at all so far. Why? Why has she said no to those 3? Why have so many failed to provoke any action whatsoever? And Suella Braverman has drawn through several of these recommendations with a red pen. I mean, it's also stated today in The Guardian that very many of these recommendations haven't been acted on at all. And in fact, the financial compensation paid to victims of the Windrush scandal has been paltry in comparison with the amount of money that it was assumed or presumed would be paid. Many of the people who suffered have died since the Windrush scandal. And yes. I would just say, I've met many of these people, and these people who were brought over here as children, some as babies. So they are British through and through. They've lived here all their lives, not just lived here, been to school here, been educated here, got married here, had children here, worked here, paid tax here, and been in every particular, in their own minds and the minds of everybody who's ever been anywhere near them, British through and through. Suddenly they're told, hang on a minute, they didn't fill out any paperwork for you when you came, when you were 3 months old, 3 years old, 4 years old. So actually, hey, guess what? You've lived here all your life. You think you're British, your children are British, you've worked, let's say, for example, in the NHS all your life, you paid tax, your whole life has been in this country, but you know what? You're not British, so you can't go to work anymore, you can't use the NHS, you can't have any money because we're not going to give you any sort of benefit because you're not British, and suddenly you are effectively evicted from your own life. Not only that, you're not the person you thought you were. You thought you were British, you're not. And where do you belong to? Jamaica, for example. Hang on a minute, says this person, I've never even been to Jamaica. I've never visited Jamaica. In fact, one of the reasons that I have never realised that I wasn't given the right kind of certification when I came here is I don't actually have a passport. I've never left this country. I arrived here as a 4-month-old baby with my parents, and I've never left. So there are people who don't have passports, and there are people who don't travel abroad. I'm one of them. So if you suddenly send me to Jamaica, it's a place I've never even seen, never dreamed I would ever go to, because I'm British through and through. And these are people, decent, hard-working, ordinary people who've just lived a life, suddenly told all the things you thought about yourself aren't true. You're not entitled to anything you think you're entitled to. And these are people who then lost their homes, they lost their relationships, they had to borrow money from relatives, they were humiliated in every way. Some of them were told they would be deported. I mean, this is the biggest of possible deals. And over this, Amber Rudd, who was then Home Secretary, lost her job as Home Secretary because it was considered to be an absolute disgrace. Then the commission was was commissioned, and the commission report was commissioned, and the idea that this inquiry would take place, the findings would be listed, and then the Home Secretary subsequently would just draw a red line through and not take any notice. This is an abomination, isn't it? This is just terrible that this can be happening. Okay, so we're focusing particularly, and so are all the papers, and so is everybody covering this, on the 3 recommendations that the Home Secretary is jettisoning. But if we look a little further, it says only 8 recommendations have been entirely enacted. 9 have not been delivered at all, of which 3 have been discontinued. The other 13 have only been partially met. A recommendation to reduce the complexity of immigration law has not been implemented. A commitment to review all the hostile environment policies introduced when Theresa May was Home Secretary has not been met, but officials said the department planned to publish several evaluation documents shortly. And then it also says Braverman's decision was widely condemned by people who've been working to secure justice for those affected. So what about the people who have been caught up in the Windrush scandal, those people who've suffered, as I said, in many cases, homelessness, terrible poverty, deep humiliation, absolute worried sick they were going to be stuck on a plane and deported often to a place they'd never even visited and didn't want to. Those people, what's happened? Some of them have died, of course, but the ones who are still alive, what's happening to them now? What is the legal situation vis-a-vis inquiries? So, for example, the Prime Minister announces an inquiry into the tax affairs of Nadim Zahawi, for example. Somebody or other compiles the report. In this case, it's going to be the ethics advisor or something to the government. The inquiry eventually is completed, it is written up, it is kind of printed out, it's in a leather-bound, volume or something or other. And then what happens? Is there a legal obligation upon the government to act upon the contents and the recommendations? Or could it be said the whole thing is pretty much for show? It's a kind of grandstanding activity that, first of all, delays any kind of verdict and kicks everything, the whole problem and issue, into the long grass. But secondly, just lies there in this leather-bound volume with no compulsion on anybody to act on any of the recommendations. And then eventually everyone forgets what it was all about in the first place. It just disappears into some library and gathers dust. Is there any legal obligation on the government when they commission an inquiry to act upon the recommendations inside it? The Home Secretary obviously thinks that she will gain some kind of political traction or some kind of political points for crossing out recommendations in an inquiry into something, and the clue's in the title here, known as the Windrush scandal. So you're meant to know by that this isn't something that is okay or that people think is all right or that people are comfortable with. It's a really big deal. People whose lives were absolutely ruined, and some of them died without any compensation. One man was offered £18,000 for having his entire life pulled from his grasp. He said when he saw it, he cried, burst into tears. I once interviewed one of these people who came, it was the saddest thing ever. He came into the studio to be interviewed with me, and he had walked, I think it was something like 18 miles to get to me with all his possessions in one plastic carrier bag. And this is a man who had worked in the NHS his entire life. Hard-working, decent, God-fearing, excellent man, an upright man. It wasn't his fault that they didn't register him when he came in as a baby, for God's sake. So what does the Home Secretary, do you imagine, think that she is gaining by putting a red pen to these recommendations? What do you think she's doing this for?
It seems when I got a bit think about where I've been, got a little bit cold, and I haven't learned everything on my own.
People are so fed up.
Here in the minus 30 seconds here in the blockhouse. We are at B minus 30 seconds here in the blockhouse.
I'm sure we should all be as happy as.
What the hell is going on, huh?
Well, this is interesting, isn't it? We've got all this mess with the electricity and gas supplies at the moment. The price is going through the roof. Naturally, people are...
Hey, right! How do we get it?